In this video, we're going to be taking a look at the ethics of medical research. So we're going to start with just some of the basics of clinical trials. We'll look at what a clinical trial is, placebo, blinding, and randomization. And then we're going to look into ethical issues regarding research. We'll look at the ethics of control groups, placebo control group versus active control group. We'll also briefly look at the ethics of research and informed consent, and a little bit on financial conflicts in research, as well as international standards of research when one country does research on a population in another country, usually a developing country where people are more vulnerable. So we'll be looking at some ethical issues regarding those issues. So let's start with a little background regarding the science of clinical trials. So basically, a clinical trial is a scientific study designed to test the efficacy and safety of some kind of medical intervention. So it doesn't even necessarily have to be some kind of drug. It could be any kind of medical intervention. Now, any kind of trial needs to be passed by an institutional review board, and sometimes these institutional review boards can be quite large organizations. An IRB reviews proposals, study proposals, to make sure that it complies with ethics and legal policy. So a clinical trial consists of two groups. The first group is the experimental group. They're the group that gets the treatment that is supposed to be tested. And then you have the control group, and this is the group that does not get the treatment to be tested. Now, there are two different kinds of control groups. On the one hand, you have a placebo control group. And you use a placebo control group in cases in which there is no effective treatment for whatever it is you're trying to treat. So the placebo control group gets a placebo, which is really no treatment at all. And then on the other hand, you have active control groups. So an active control group receives the standard treatment when you're trying to test a different kind of treatment. And many ethical issues arise regarding whether it's okay to use a placebo group or an active control group, when it's okay, when it's not okay, and we'll be taking a look at that. Now, blinding is an important part of any clinical trial. This is a procedure to ensure that the patients and maybe the researchers don't know which interventions the subjects receive. So with a single blind procedure, the patients don't know what they're receiving. Double blind, the patients nor the researchers know which patients are receiving the experimental treatment or the standard or placebo. So blinding is important because it helps prevent bias in the trial. Okay, a little bit more on the background. I want to get through this kind of quickly. Randomization is important. This is assigning subjects randomly to experimental and control groups. This is important, again, to prevent bias. Now, generally, there are more or less three stages of any clinical trial. The first phase is the non-therapeutic stage, in which the drug is tested for safety, but not so much efficacy. This can involve vivisection or testing on animals. Phase 2 is the drug is tested on a larger group and is tested for efficacy and safety. So safety and efficacy. And then the third phase is usually an even larger group where it's tested for efficacy, safety, and how it might compare to standard treatment. All right, I want to briefly take a look at the AZT African study, which took place in 1994. So AZT was a drug that you would take during pregnancy, which would help prevent transmission of HIV to the child. In 1994, researchers had proven that giving this drug during pregnancy would cut by 2/3 the transmission of HIV from mother to child. And this study was done in North America. A year later, 1995, a number of American organizations conducted a similar study in Africa. So a big thing to consider here is that the study done on the population in Africa, this population was highly vulnerable in a number of ways. They're in a developing country. They were quite poor. They were illiterate, victims of STDs, and they didn't have available treatment for this. So the big issue here is that a study was being conducted on them, and they used a placebo group, which means the control group did not receive treatment, even though there was already a standard treatment in the United States, even though they've already determined that AZT, the drug that they were experimenting on with, was effective. So the ethical question in this study, one of the ethical questions, is whether or not it was justified to use a placebo-controlled group. And we're going to get into the ethics of this more in a second. So when we do that, keep this study in mind. Another study that I'll look at pretty quickly is something that happened in the mid-90s. So this study recruited 108 poor, vulnerable black families to live in East Baltimore houses with lead paint. So they wanted to study the effects of lead on kids. And you can look at the book for a more detailed account of the study. But the problem here is that they were not fully informed of the risks involved in living in a house, especially with kids, with lead paint. And so the purpose of this case study is to look at the importance of informed consent when looking into a study. So the ethical question here is, would any reasonable person have given consent if they were fully informed to participating in the study? And many people would say no. If they were fully informed, they wouldn't have given consent because they would have seen the risks involved. So again, part of the purpose of this is to illustrate the importance of informed consent when asking subjects to participate in a study. They need to be fully informed. So when we look at many of these cases, the Krieger lead paint study, the AZT study, and others like the Tuskegee study, which is a very important study, a case in bioethics, we've come to a number of ethical requirements that any ethical study needs to meet. So let's take a look at these ethical requirements. So the first is that subjects must give their informed, voluntary consent. That means that we've talked about informed consent before, but they need to know the risks that are involved, the treatments that are available, so on and so forth. And it needs to be voluntary, which means that the consent should not be forced and it should not be coerced. And this is going to raise some other ethical issues here in a little bit. The second requirement is that the study must be designed to minimize risks to subjects and to offer an acceptable balance of risks and benefits. So if they participate in the study, it shouldn't be too risky. For example, there shouldn't be a 50% chance that they're going to die if they take the experimental drug. And if they're in the placebo group, for example, they should be able to benefit in some way from the study. For example, they should be compensated by getting the experimental drug if it's proven effective. The third ethical requirement is that subjects must be selected fairly to avoid exploiting or unjustly excluding them. So selection must be done in a fair way. The fourth is that the subject's privacy must be protected. The fifth is that the study must be approved by an independent panel, like an IRB. And generally speaking, the research should be guided by the principles of bioethics, those general principles that we've talked about before, namely the principle of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice. And we're going to look at whether or not certain kinds of studies may actually prevent a researcher from fulfilling the principle of beneficence. We'll take a look at that here in a minute. So let's start with the ethics of placebo-controlled groups. So again, a placebo-controlled group is when one group gets the experimental treatment, like a medication, and the other group just gets a placebo, which is really no treatment at all. Now, one ethical question that arises is, can the deliberate non-treatment of patients actually be justified? Because remember, a physician or a healthcare professional is bound by these principles. They are bound by the principle of beneficence, which says that you should help others. So it almost seems like using a placebo control group undermines that duty to help others. Generally, the use of placebos is unethical when effective treatments are already available. So this is one reason why the AZT study was arguably unethical, is because they used a placebo group even though there was already an effective treatment available. So usually testing new, unproved treatment against a placebo is permissible only if no treatment has been shown to work. So a placebo group is permissible usually only when there is no standard treatment available. Otherwise, you have a group that's not receiving any treatment whatsoever, even though there's treatment available. That's unjust, unfair. But this rule isn't necessarily absolute. There may be cases where the disease is potentially fatal, and it may be wrong to continue a placebo study through the 3 phases. So for example, we go through phase 2, and there's no standard proven treatment, but it looks like this experimental drug really is helping people. And if you move on to phase 3, more people in the placebo group are going to keep dying. So in this case, it may be ethical to just give everyone the experimental drug. But this is up for debate. Okay, so we looked at the ethics of placebo control groups. Now let's look at the ethics of active control groups. So again, an active control group is a group that gets the standard treatment, and then the experimental group gets the new experimental treatment, which they're hoping will be more effective than the standard treatment. So one question that arises is, do control groups treat patients merely as a means to scientific knowledge? So with this control group, even if they're getting the standard treatment, researchers may think that they're getting less effective treatment because they might think that the experimental treatment is better. So are the researchers using the participants in the control group just to get scientific knowledge? And remember, this might be a way of undermining their dignity if you're just merely using them, and that could be morally problematic. But generally, most ethicists would say that you're not just merely using these individuals, rather, because the individuals give informed voluntary consent, you are still respecting them and treating them with dignity because they have given informed consent. Now, another interesting question that arises is this: do randomized trials prevent the physician or researcher from fulfilling their duty of beneficence to the patients? One might say that knowingly not giving the patient the treatment, or the more effective treatment, or what she suspects is the more effective treatment, may be making her go against the principle of beneficence, because she might be knowingly not helping certain patients. She's allowing some patients to receive the standard and what she may think less effective treatment. So these randomized trials may prevent the physician from fulfilling this principle of beneficence, since she knows that these control group patients are not receiving treatment, or in the case of active control groups, she might suspect that they're receiving less effective treatment. Now, one way to address this worry is to say that if the physician is in, or the healthcare professional is in equipoise, then she is not undermining the principle of beneficence. In other words, if the physician or researcher has a rational balance between the efficacy of the 2 alternatives, that the treatment being tested may just as be effective as the non-treatment, then she would not be undermining the principle of beneficence. And that's because in that case, as far as the researcher knows, the active control group, that treatment may be just as effective as the experimental treatment. The experimental treatment may be just as effective as the treatment in the active control group. Now, someone may say, well, what if the physician has a preference or a hunch in favor of the tested treatment in the experimental group? It seems like in that case, they are knowingly benefiting the experimental group, but not benefiting the control group who's not receiving that treatment. And in that case, it seems like they're undermining the principle of beneficence. Now, there's a couple replies to this worry. One is that genuine equipoise applies to the medical community, not to the individual physician. So if the medical community as a whole thinks that, well, each kind of treatment could be just as good as the other, then the physician would not be undermining the principle of beneficence. Second reply is that a physician's preference or hunch just isn't really reliable enough for us to say for sure that one treatment is going to be better than the other, or for the physician to say for sure. The third reply is that what really matters here is that the patient is fully informed. If the patient is fully informed, then you are respecting that patient's autonomy, and it's permissible. There are other ethical issues that arise regarding informed consent and payment to patients. So often, subjects are paid to participate in a study, and that payment is supposed to be an incentive. It incentivizes them to participate in the study. Otherwise, researchers would not get enough subjects. Now, the ethical question is whether or not large payments to patients to incentivize them to participate in some trial and may get them to consent when they ordinarily would not consent to participating in the trial. In those kinds of cases, are the patients coerced, or do we have a case of undue inducement? So again, you have patients who normally would not participate in the trial, but you say, hey, if you participate, I'll give you $100. So they participate. Does that count as coercion or undue inducement? If it does, then it's morally suspect. This suggests that maybe inducements should be limited. There should be sort of a limit to how much you can pay patients to participate in a study. If a study is particularly risky and you offer them $1,000 to participate in it, then and they normally wouldn't participate in it because they think it would be too risky, but the $1,000 pushes them into it or nudges them. Some might say, well, that's sort of a kind of coercive. That's unduly inducing them, and so we should limit the amount of money that's paid to participants. But there may be problems with this line of thought. So one response to that line of reasoning is that, and I'll quote, if the independent review panel has already concluded that the risk-benefit ratio of the research is acceptable, that it's not too risky, how can a large payment harm the subject? So this response is basically saying you're not really harming the subject if the study is already past the IRB. And then Brody goes on to say, and in what way are large payments for acceptable research coercive or exploitative? So if the research is already past the review board, then it's already deemed as not too risky. So it doesn't really matter whether you pay them or not. You're not going to be coercing them. So that's one reply to this worry. Okay, so in this video, I want to briefly address financial conflicts with research and medical care. Many people already know that the pharmaceutical industry has a pretty large reach into different areas of medicine and policy. And I have a video on the module that goes into more detail about this, but it's worth touching on some points here. So pharmaceutical companies fund most of the research that are done at universities, and they don't fund independent review of that research, nor do they publicize any bad results. And the rest I'll quote Pence, who's the author of the textbook. There have been several scandals that erupted in the 90s where a few physicians appeared to have taken millions of dollars from drug companies for dubious research. So what this suggests is that this funding of research can lend itself to forms of corruption. Another point is that physicians who work for drug companies can make $500,000 a year giving talks to physicians to promote a pharmaceutical company's new drug. So what this illustrates is that it's very lucrative to represent a drug company if you are a physician. Another point is almost all medical practices allow drug representatives to buy them and their staff expensive daily lunches or dinners. So this may be problematic because it could produce some bias. And now I want to address some ethical issues that arise with doing research in developing countries. So the AZT case is an example of this, of companies or researchers from a developed country like the US doing research on more vulnerable populations and a developing. These are special cases and raise special ethical questions. One ethical question is, how can we prevent vulnerable patients from being exploited by research practices? And these patients in developing countries are vulnerable in a number of ways. They may be illiterate, uneducated, living in impoverished conditions without treatment, so they may be desperate for treatment. They also may be non-white. That's important because implicit racism can come into play, which makes it more likely they could be exploited. So how can we prevent these vulnerable patients from being exploited in these cases? In the next slide, I'll give some possible answers to that. Does this require just compensation? So does preventing vulnerable patients from being exploited, does that just require just compensation, paying them, or does it require some other things? So we'll come back to that one. A second important question is, how can patients give informed consent in certain kinds of cases? So for example, some patients in developing countries who may be participating in a trial may be very much uneducated and illiterate and may not be able to understand what's going on in the trial. They may not be able to understand the costs and benefits because of their illiteracy. So in that case, it seems like they simply cannot give informed consent. So in those cases, is it okay for a proxy to give informed consent on their behalf? For example, should tribal leaders be able to give informed consent on behalf of test subjects? Does it matter whether or not their society is more collective and less individualistic? The United States and the West in general is very individualistic. Individual rights are very important. In other societies and their cultures, it's more communal. So does that matter when it comes to giving informed consent? If the society, the culture is more communal, would it then be okay to have, say, a tribal leader represent a tribe and give informed consent on their behalf? So these are quite difficult questions to answer. Another question is it right to apply standards of research of developed countries to research in developing countries, or can there be some kind of double standard? Is that justified? Are there special problems of context in doing research on poor illiterate people in developing countries? So that's a broad question that sort of encapsulates some of these other issues that we've been looking at. But let's go back to number one. How can we prevent vulnerable patients from being exploited? A possible solution to this is for research groups to develop a long-term partnership with the developing country. And this long-term partnership can help ensure that the population that's being tested on is not being exploited. And this partnership can involve a number of things. For example, it could involve this. Research on vulnerable populations should be done only if those populations will benefit from the research. So if they are tested on and the drug is effective, then they should all probably get that drug to be helped. The second part of the solution is that research subjects should receive the drug if it works, as I said before. And also to build long-term partnerships, helping the developing country So let's go back to that first issue. How do you prevent vulnerable populations in developing countries from being exploited? So a general solution could be something like this. Research groups developing a long-term partnership with the developing country, and that can involve a number of different things. So one way of preventing exploitation of vulnerable populations is that the research on the vulnerable population should only be done if they will actually benefit in some kind of way. So the research group and whoever's sponsoring the research group should give back to that population, to that society in some kind of way. The research subjects should also receive the drug if that drug is effective, and that's a kind of compensation. So the population that's being researched on should receive that kind of compensation. And generally, the research group should build long-term partnerships with the host country in that society. And that's a way of ensuring that the research group doesn't just use that population in order to gain scientific knowledge or to demonstrate that a drug works. And that long-term partnership can involve helping the developing country build infrastructure that might be necessary to help the study, and so on. So if no partnership exists, researchers will be perceived as being exploitative, and countries may refuse to grant rights to investigate, to take samples, or to apply for patents. So there needs to be a partnership between the research group and their host country and the developing country, and that should help avoid these problems of exploitation.